They said the North was already lost. 30 requests for help, sent over 3 months, every one of them ignored. The noble houses of the kingdom sat warm in their halls, and chose to let the men at the edge of the world bleed alone. And when the final wall came down and the fires started, it was not a foreign enemy standing in judgment of those nobles. It was a prince they had spent years mocking, barely recovered, one hand still shaking from the battle, ordering executions with the quiet certainty of a man who had run out of patience. But that moment comes later. Before the frozen walls and the burning castle, there is a sword, and before the sword, there is a boy. A boy everyone had already written off. The royal court of the Leonberger kingdom had seen many disgraces in its long history, but the first prince, Adrian Leonberger, was considered the definitive one. At 16, he was obese, contemptuous, and as popular among his own guards as a blister. He had sold out the kingdom at 13, a detail no one forgot and no one let him forget. He had destroyed the cultivation of loyal knights, men who had served the crown with their bodies, simply because they had disagreed with him on an afternoon he was bored. His father, the king, did not speak to him if he could help it. His tutors reported nothing. The court tracked his movements the way people track a stain on a wall, not out of interest, but out of habit. The sword Gruhen had watched the Leonberger bloodline for 4 centuries. He had watched it go from a peasant hero who carried nothing but hunger and refusal to quit, all the way down to this, a boy who broke things when he was unhappy and called it discipline. The sword had passed through 15 hands in those 400 years, and not one of them had been worthy of being called what Leonberg himself once was. So when the boy picked up the sword one afternoon to show off to a servant, Gruhen did not expect to feel anything. He had stopped expecting things long ago. Then the boy stumbled. Then he fell. Then the sword went through him. It was an accident. That was the part Gruhen would carry longest. Not the guilt of intent, but the guilt of consequence. The prince was dead in seconds, the soul departing cleanly, and the sword found itself lodged in a warm, empty body with nowhere else to go. What happened next was not a plan. It was desperation dressed up as instinct. Gruhen took the body. He opened the eyes. He breathed. The first thing he thought was that he had never had lungs before and he did not like them. The second thing he thought was that he needed a reason for why the prince was now lying on the floor with his own sword through his side. He settled on amnesia. Simple, believable, given the head wound. He pulled the sword out, which hurt considerably more than he had expected, and lay back and waited for someone to find him. The king arrived first. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has found an old piece of furniture he no longer wants but has not yet decided where to leave it. He asked how the prince felt. The prince said he could not remember the last few months clearly. The king absorbed this, nodded once, and left. The queen arrived second, and her reaction was the opposite in every way. She fussed. She brought teas he had not asked for, and rearranged the pillows 3 times and held the prince's hand while asking if he remembered her. He did not know her. He was a sword who had never had a mother and had no idea what to do with one. He said yes, he remembered her, and she cried in a way that made him feel, for the first time in centuries, actually guilty. The body needed work. That was obvious within the first day. When Gruhen tried to channel mana through the body, the system recoiled like a pulled thread. The prince's mana heart, whatever small abused fragment of it had existed, was gone. His stamina was the stamina of someone who had never climbed a stair without pausing halfway. The fat on the body was not incidental. It was architectural. It had been built over years of deliberate inactivity and was not interested in leaving. And the kingdom's cultivation method, mana chains, single to penta, the standard by which every knight was ranked, the body could not sustain it at all. The prince's constitution was allergic to the method in a way that would never change. None of this was actually a problem. Gruhen did not know mana chains. He was 400 years old and had spent those centuries in contact with the greatest swordsmen who had ever lived, and none of them had used mana chains. They had used the older method, the one the kingdom had abandoned, the mana heart. When the queen sent a mana tonic, expensive, well-meaning, unnecessary, Gruhen used it as the seed. He sat with the pain of it for an entire night, forcing the mana through the body's resistance, condensing it, compressing it into something that could hold. The feeling was like pushing a river through a closed fist. He did not stop. He had been patient for 400 years. One night was nothing. By morning, the mana heart existed. Small, unsteady, flickering like a candle in a draught. It was enough to begin. Count Bael Valorhard arrived at the palace 3 days later, and the first thing he did was look at his nephew like a man inspecting a collapsed ceiling he had always suspected would fall. He was a broad man, Bael, the kind of broad that comes from 4 decades of actual use rather than deliberate effort. Quad Chain Knight, commander of the 3rd Legion, one of the kingdom's 5 silver lions, which meant that in any room he walked into, he was probably the most dangerous person present. He had the face of someone who gave honest assessments whether they were wanted or not. He examined the mana heart. He did not touch it. He looked, and then he looked away. He told the prince that it was an old-fashioned technique, associated with wanderers and minor clans who could not afford proper instruction. He demonstrated what modern cultivation did to a mana heart in a direct confrontation. He channeled 1 ring's worth of mana chain through his palm and pressed it against the air between them, and the pressure alone made the protagonist's small mana heart flutter and recoil like something frightened. The chain's structure was clean, precise, domineering. The heart was a candle. The chain was a wall. Bael did not say he had failed. He just looked at the protagonist with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he already knew. The protagonist looked back at him and said nothing. Inside, Gruhen was thinking about a man he had known 300 years before the kingdom existed. A wanderer with no name who had walked across 4 countries using a mana heart no larger than a fist, and who had killed things the court knights of his era would have needed 30 men to approach. The technique was not inferior. The world had just forgotten what it looked like when it was done right. He did not explain this. It was not yet the time for explanations. What he did instead was go to the library. He was looking for something specific, a reference, a footnote, any trace of the old methods preserved in text. He found it in a minor historical compendium, half a page, tucked between a trade agreement and a record of grain prices. A man called Altringen, who had been recorded by a traveling scribe as using arts that fit neither swordcraft nor magic. The scribe had no framework for what he was watching, and so described it purely as action. The man moved, and things ended. The sword technique he used was called, in the margin, the Dragon Slayer. The protagonist set the book down. The Dragon Slayer technique was not in any margin of history. He knew it because he had been the sword when it was performed. He had been the blade in the hand of the man who used it to cut through the neck of the White Frost Dragon while standing on the creature's own spine at 5,000 feet above the ground. The technique was not a training exercise. It was not a foundation drill. It was the most complete killing method any human being had ever constructed, and somewhere in the last 4 centuries it had been simplified and handed to beginners as a warm-up. He found the court training manual. He found the technique listed on page 4, under Basics, recommended for ages 8 and up. Something in the sword that was also a prince decided that this was, in its own way, the funniest and most offensive thing he had encountered since waking up in a body. He started practicing it that afternoon. Count Bael assigned himself as reluctant instructor, not out of warmth, but because someone had to prevent the prince from embarrassing the family, and he was the only one who would not be bought off or bullied. The training he designed was not gentle. It was the kind of training a man designs when he does not expect the student to last 2 weeks and wants to make the point clearly. Early mornings, full physical conditioning, sword work until the hands stopped working properly, then written study of formations until the eyes did the same. The protagonist did not last 2 weeks. He lasted considerably longer. He did not enjoy it. The body was genuinely terrible at most of it, but he had centuries of understanding what work was supposed to feel like, and he recognized the gap between discomfort and actual damage. He pushed to the edge of one and stopped precisely before the other, every day, without fail. The fat came off in visible stages, the calluses built. The wooden training swords broke with enough frequency that the supply closet had to be restocked twice. His mana heart, fed by consistent exertion, grew denser and more stable, and the mana sensitivity disorder, which had given the original prince headaches in any room with active magic, faded until it disappeared entirely. 1 month in, Gruhen ran his own internal assessment and found traits that had been marked as weak now shifting. His instincts in the body were better. His reading of distance and angle was approaching something usable. The mana heart, still small, had developed a texture, a solidity. that made it feel less like a candle and more like a coal. Bale noticed. He said nothing about it. He simply increased the difficulty. The sparring sessions came next, and they were the protagonist's idea. The original Adrian had managed, in 16 years of living, to personally offend a significant percentage of the palace's knights and noble sons. Grudges had accumulated the way snow accumulates, quietly, steadily, until the weight became structural. The protagonist saw this not as a liability, but as a resource. He sent formal challenge letters to everyone who had a grievance, framed as an offer to resolve the matter properly, one bout at a time. They came for blood. He understood that. The first few challengers arrived with the energy of men who had been waiting for permission to break something, and that something was the first prince's record of unearned arrogance. What they found instead confused them. He did not move like the prince they remembered. He did not carry himself like the prince they remembered. The weight was gone, the contemptuous slouch was gone, and in their place was something they could not name immediately. A stillness, a particular quality of attention, the way a man stands when he has seen enough fights to know which ones are already over before they begin. He won the bouts. He won them without drama, without cruelty, and in most cases, without the opponent understanding clearly what had happened. When someone went down, he stopped. He helped them up. He said, in the measured tones of a man who has considered his words, that he was aware the previous behavior required more than a sparring win to answer for, and that he intended to address it properly when he could. Most of them left confused. A few left thoughtful. One, a young retainer whose family sword the original Adrian had snapped during a tantrum, left with a replacement blade and a formal apology delivered quietly in the corridor after the bout, which no one witnessed and which the retainer told no one about for 6 weeks. The winds accumulated. The whispers shifted. Not to approval, it was too early for that, and the court's memory was too long. But the nature of the uncertainty changed. People who had been certain of one thing were now uncertain of something different. Then came Taylor Tailheim, and the Dragon Slayer state made its first appearance. Taylor was a single-chain apprentice, which meant he was properly ranked, not just palace-trained. The bout should have been, by the numbers, a reasonable match for the protagonist at his current level. It was not a reasonable match. Within 30 seconds, the protagonist had found every gap in Taylor's structure and was inside them, and the Dragon Slayer form activated the way fire activates when air suddenly arrives, without warning, completely. The crimson aura was not metaphorical. It was visible. It spread from his grip up through his shoulders, and the temperature around him dropped slightly, which was not something that happened during normal cultivation. His read of Taylor's movements accelerated past what was useful and into something else. Something that classified the opponent not as a person making choices, but as a collection of weak points, arranged in a pattern that could be resolved. He lifted the training sword. Count Bale's hand came down on his shoulder from behind like a closed gate. He stopped. The aura receded. Taylor was on the ground, uninjured, breathing hard, staring up at a face he did not recognize. Bale said nothing until they were alone. Then he asked, with the careful precision of a man who wanted an exact answer, what that had been. The protagonist said he was still learning to control it. Bale looked at him for a long time. Then he said that this was apparently true of several things, and that they would address it before anything else. It was, in its way, the most honest conversation they had yet had with each other. Arwen Karayan arrived at the sparring yard on the first morning with the posture of someone who had already decided how the day would end. She was the finest knight in the Iron Lion Order below the rank of captain, a fact that had taken her longer to prove than it should have, because the Order's evaluation system had a habit of crediting the men standing near exceptional performances rather than the woman performing them. She had spent 7 years fighting twice as hard for recognition that other knights received by existing. The original Adrian had made the situation worse in his specific way. He had harassed her, proposed to her without asking, and when she declined, spent 6 months using his position to make her professional life as difficult as possible. She came to the duel to win. She came with the particular motivation of someone who has been wronged by the powerful and finally has legitimate grounds to respond. The protagonist read her the moment she walked in. His judgment authority, the ability to assess anyone at a glance, name their traits, estimate their ceiling, gave him a picture of her so complete it felt almost intrusive. What he saw was not what the Iron Lion Order had put in its records. What he saw was exceptional. Her instincts were rare. Her physical gifts were rarer. She was being wasted in a structure that did not know how to use her. He did not tell her any of this. He picked up his sword and let day one begin. She was faster than he expected her to be, and better than her rank suggested. She attacked with the controlled aggression of someone who knows they have range and endurance advantages and intends to use both. The protagonist spent the first day doing something he was fairly certain no one had done to Arwen Karayan in a formal duel before. He made her work for every exchange without giving her a readable pattern to work from. Day one ended without a decisive result. Standard rules. If neither party concedes, the contest resumes the following morning. She came back on day two sharper and more careful, which told him she had spent the night analyzing. He adjusted accordingly. The exchanges were longer now, more layered. She was good enough to make him actually consider his options before committing to them, which was not something every opponent had required. He won day two on points but not on submission. She bowed, composed, and said she would return in the morning. On day three, she came with everything she had. He had been saving his actual speed. Not all of it. The Dragon Slayer state remained locked away behind the lessons Bale had been drilling into him about consequence and control. But his natural speed, the accumulated movement knowledge of centuries compressed into this body's nervous system, was something he had not shown her yet. He had been matching her pace, staying within a range that kept the duel interesting, watching how she moved and what she defaulted to when pressed. On day three, he stopped matching. The gap was not theatrical. It was quiet and immediate and final. She went for an overhead sequence she had landed twice before, and the sword was somewhere else before her blade was halfway through the motion. She tried to recover into a defensive bind and found no blade to bind against. She adjusted her footwork and he was already past her adjustment, inside her range, training sword resting against her collarbone. She was still for several seconds. Then she asked what his wish was, because she had lost and the terms were the terms. He told her that he wanted her as his personal knight. Not a crown appointment, not a formal posting, her loyalty, genuinely given, to him as a person rather than to his rank. He told her he understood this was an unusual request, and she was not obligated to fulfill it exactly as stated. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. Then she said she would do it. He told her he knew she was exceptional. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said most things, not as flattery, but as information. He said the order did not know what it had in her, and that if she stayed with him, he would give her the kind of assignment that matched what she actually was. It was the first time in 7 years anyone with actual authority had said that to her. She absorbed it without expression. Later, after she had left, he considered whether he had handled it correctly. He decided he probably had, which was unusual for him given that he had never managed a human being before and was largely working from inference. He found Adelia Byron by accident. She was mopping a corridor on the east side of the palace, the narrow one that led toward the old archive rooms, when he turned the wrong corner during a walk he had not planned carefully. She flinched when she saw him. Not the polite flinch of a servant caught by surprise, but the full-body recoil of someone who has learned through experience that a particular person appearing around a corner is the beginning of something bad. She had a scar on her forearm, old enough to be fully healed, prominent enough to be unmistakable. He used his judgment authority without thinking about it. What came back stopped him in place. The numbers attached to her were not made numbers. They were not even good night numbers. They were the kind of numbers that appeared once a generation, if that. The ceiling of a person whose body and spirit are built for a level of power that the world around them has simply never required them to reach. The traits listed included things that made him reconsider everything he had assumed about the lower halls of the palace. Butcher, warmonger, fragile heart, gluttony, and buried beneath all of it, nearly invisible unless you knew what you were looking for, a bloodline marker he recognized the way you recognize a face from a painting you studied long ago. Agnes Byron, the iron-blooded Sword Queen, one of the 5 founding heroes who had stood alongside Leonberg at the end of the Great War. He was looking at her descendant, scrubbing a floor. He told her she did not need to be afraid of him. He said he knew that was not a meaningful thing to say given what the previous Adrian had done, and that he was not expecting her to believe it immediately. She did not believe it immediately. He gave her a mana heart anyway. Not as a gesture, as a practical decision. The talent in her needed a foundation, and a foundation needed to be built before anything else could happen. He spent 2 evenings teaching her the basics of mana condensation, adapting the method for a body that had never touched cultivation and did not yet know what it was capable of. On the 3rd evening, she asked him why he was doing this. He told her the truth, which was that she was extraordinary and the kingdom could not afford to leave extraordinary things lying unused in corridors. She thought about this for a while and then told him she would try not to waste it. He told her that was all he was asking. What he did not tell her was that watching her learning it, the way she approached each session with the absolute concentration of someone who had never been given anything and therefore treated every small gain as precious, reminded him of someone he had known long ago. Leonberg had learned with exactly that quality of attention. The sword did not say this out loud. It was not information that would have been useful to her, and it was not information he was ready to discuss. Uncle Bale learned about Adelia 3 days later, assessed her in about 30 seconds using his own veteran's instincts, and attempted to recruit her into the 3rd Legion's training program. This did not go well. The protagonist found out mid-afternoon and arrived at the training yard where Bale was making his case to find something rising through his chest that he had not experienced since the last time someone had tried to take something that was not theirs to take. The Dragon Slayer state came up fast, faster than it had with Taylor, faster than he could manage cleanly, and the aura reached his hands before he pulled it back. He pulled it back, barely. The spiritual cost was real. He spent that night in controlled stillness, keeping Blackhorn, the demonic aspect of the sword that lived beneath the Dragon Slayer state, always waiting for a lapse in control, from finding purchase in the anger. It was the longest night since the first one in the body, and it ended with him cold and tired and aware that his attachment to both Adelia and the mana heart he had built was apparently more personal than strategic. He thought about this for a while. He concluded that he did not need to understand it fully to continue. Bale came to him the next morning and proposed a bet. The terms were direct. If the protagonist could force him back even half a step using only the resistance of 1 mana ring's worth of cultivation, Bale would acknowledge that the mana heart path was not worthless. If he could not, Bale would take Adelia into the 3rd Legion, and the protagonist would stop pretending that a single ring cultivation level was the foundation for anything serious. The protagonist accepted. What followed was the most technically dangerous thing he had attempted since waking up in the body. He had been working, quietly and privately, on what the old texts called Gesta Santorum, the heroic martial poems, epic verses that channeled the accumulated weight of historical battles into the user's body when recited. He had learned of them not from a text but from memory. He had been present for their creation, or for the creation of some of them, and the ones that had survived the centuries were like hearing a language he had once spoken. He had spent the equivalent of 100 sparring sessions just rebuilding the first poem into something he could access. Against Bale, he recited it during the exchange. The poem of the Dragon Slayer opened like a door nobody had touched in 4 centuries. The power was not the clean chain pressure of a mana ring. It was older, heavier, carrying in its syllables the memory of actual combat, actual stakes, actual death. It moved through the protagonist's arm and down the blade and met Bale's quad chain resistance at full extension. Bale went back half a step. His face, in the moment after, was not the face of a man who had lost a bet. It was the face of a man who has touched something that does not belong in the world he thought he understood, and who is now revising the world. The protagonist paid for it immediately. The spiritual backlash of accessing a poem at a rank his body had not yet earned hit him the way a wall hits someone who did not see it coming. He did not lose consciousness, he had enough control for that, but he spent 3 days in bed with his mana heart making sounds it should not have been making, and his head full of images from battles that had happened before the kingdom existed. Bale came to see him on the 2nd day. He sat in the chair by the bed and did not speak for a while. Then he said he owed the protagonist something. He said he would give anything that was in his power to give. The protagonist, still horizontal and considerably less comfortable than he appeared, said he wanted to leave the palace. Bale looked at him. He said he wanted to go north. He wanted to see the kingdom he stopped, adjusted. His ancestor had built. He wanted to see Winter Castle. Bale was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said he would arrange it. He also arranged, without telling the protagonist until it was already done, for the prince's probation to be lifted 2 months early. The protagonist found out from Arwen, who mentioned it in passing while reporting that she was ready to return to training. He did not ask Bale about it. He understood that some things were more easily accepted when they were not discussed directly, and Bale appeared to operate on the same principle. The road out of the capital took them first through Ellen County. Ellen County was the kingdom's forge. Every serious blade in the Leonberger military had passed through its workshops at some point, and the smell of the place, coal and hot metal and the particular sharpness of quenched steel, hung over the town the way weather hangs over a coast. The protagonist noticed it the moment the caravan rolled through the outer gate and found it, to his own surprise, genuinely pleasant. They were given a tour of the main workshop by the county lord's son, a polite young man who was clearly more comfortable with inventory than conversation. The forge floor was loud and organized, a dozen craftsmen working simultaneously, and most of the delegation moved through it quickly, pausing for the notable pieces and moving on. The protagonist stopped at the back corner and did not move. There was an old man there, thin, white-haired, seated on a stool that had been repaired so many times it was more patched than original, working on a single sword, not finishing it, working on it, in the middle stages, with the absolute concentration of someone who has temporarily forgotten that other people exist. The blade on the anvil was not visibly different from the other blades in the room, but the old man's hands moved over it with a quality of attention that was different from anyone else present. The county lord's son said something about moving to the next room. The delegation moved. The protagonist stayed. He stood at a distance that was close enough to see but far enough not to intrude, and he watched the old man work. He did not ask questions. He did not make notes. He stood with his hands at his sides and gave the work the attention it was asking for. The old man did not look up. The delegation completed their tour, had a formal dinner, spent the night, and prepared to leave the following morning. The protagonist returned to the forge at dawn and stood in the same corner. The old man was already there. He had been making this sword for 6 months, the county lord's son had mentioned. Everyone had stopped asking him when he would finish it. On the morning of departure, the protagonist was already at the caravan when a servant came running from the forge with a wrapped bundle and a message. The old man had finished the sword. He was asking to see the prince. The forge was quiet at that hour. The other craftsmen had not yet arrived. The old man sat on his stool with the sword across his knees, still wrapped, and looked at the protagonist with eyes that were tired in the way old eyes get tired. Not from the morning, but from the accumulated weight of years of seeing things clearly. He said that the sword had been waiting for someone specific. He said he had not known who, so he had kept working until the waiting felt like it was over. He held it out. The protagonist unwrapped it. The blade was not spectacular in the way that showcase swords are spectacular. It was not decorated, not jeweled, not the kind of thing that catches light for dramatic effect. It was the kind of blade that looks exactly as dangerous as it is. The proportions correct, the balance precise, the edge holding a geometry that suggested considerable thought about what edges are actually for. The old man had named it Damarong, which meant something in an old dialect that translated approximately as the light at the edge of darkness, the particular color of the sky in the minutes before actual dawn. The protagonist held it and felt, in the grip, something he had not felt in 4 centuries. Not recognition exactly. More like a conversation beginning. He thanked the old man. The old man looked at him for a moment with an expression the protagonist could not fully read, and then he said that he was glad the waiting was finished, and that he thought he would rest now. He died that afternoon, peacefully, in his chair, with the stool's latest repair still fresh. The county lord sent a rider after the caravan to inform them. The protagonist received the news at the evening camp, read the message twice, and then folded it and put it in the inner pocket of his coat. He did not speak about it. Arwen, who had been watching him since the rider arrived, did not ask. She had developed an instinct for the difference between moments that wanted words and moments that did not. They also acquired a second sword at Ellen, a mid-grade magic blade offered by the Lord's son as a gesture of political goodwill, the kind of gift that is more about the giving than the object. The protagonist accepted it politely and put it away and did not think about it much. Damarong was already what it needed to be. Iron Lion Castle was 2 days further north, and it received them the way a fortress receives a surprise inspection, with technically correct hospitality arranged too quickly to be comfortable. The Iron Lions were the kingdom's premier knight order. They had opinions about the first prince that matched the rest of the kingdoms, and the additional fact that their most talented knight had now declared personal loyalty to him had not improved those opinions. The protagonist asked, on the first evening, to spar. The Castellan agreed with the expression of a man agreeing to something he expects to be brief. The protagonist fought 17 Iron Lion knights across 2 days, including several who held official double-chain rankings, which made them substantially above what the palace challengers had been. He won every bout. He won the 17th the same way he had won the first, without apparent urgency, without the Dragon Slayer state, without anything flashy. Just the particular quality of presence that belongs to someone who has seen every variation of every technique the kingdom currently teaches and knows exactly where each one ends. Then Dunham arrived. Dunham was on the verge of triple chain, which placed him at the upper threshold of what the Iron Lion Order officially contained. He was not friendly about the situation. He fought with the controlled fury of a man who has decided to prove something on behalf of everyone watching. The bout lasted considerably longer than the previous 17. During the exchange, the poem of sparring, which the protagonist had been building and refining across every bout in the palace, the accumulated technique of 100 sparring victories, reached a tipping point. He had felt it coming for the last 3 bouts, the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. Against Dunham's full pressure, the poem crested and shifted, and what came out the other side was not the poem of sparring anymore. The poem of duel, at extraordinary rank, was something different in kind rather than degree. It did not make him faster or stronger in simple terms. It made every exchange read as a complete unit, entry, middle, resolution, simultaneously, so that committing to a technique felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of what was already determined. Against Dunham, he stopped reacting and started arriving. The bout ended with the protagonist's blade at Dunham's throat and Dunham's sword 3 feet away on the ground, which neither of them had quite tracked the trajectory of. The Iron Lions watching were quiet for a moment. Then someone started and the rest followed. They saluted him. Not the polite acknowledgement of a formal superior, but the specific salute of soldiers deciding for themselves that someone has earned something. The protagonist accepted it without expression, which was the right call, because expressing the reaction he was actually having would have required explaining centuries of context. Count Bale watched the salute from the edge of the yard with his arms crossed, and the particular expression of a man who has been proved right about something he did not expect to be proved right about. When the protagonist came off the yard, Bale walked beside him for a moment without speaking. Then he said he wanted to say something formally. He said it that evening, in the castle's main hall, with the Iron Lion commanders present and the relevant witnesses standing properly. He declared himself the first prince's guardian and announced his formal support for the prince's succession, not as the most likely outcome, but as the correct one, and he was prepared to argue the distinction to anyone who wanted to have the argument. The protagonist listened to this with the neutral expression he had been developing for situations that required it. Inside, he was aware of something that was not quite sentiment, but was adjacent to it. The particular feeling of watching someone choose to stand in a difficult place because they have decided it is the right place to stand. He said thank you. Bale told him not to make it sentimental. He didn't. The return to the capital arrived with complications that had been waiting patiently. Sigrun appeared at the royal banquet like a fact that everyone had forgotten to account for. She was an elder high elf, nearly 1,000 years old, born at hero rank, and carrying the specific energy of someone who has outlived every framework people have tried to put around her. She was also, the protagonist noted with his judgment authority the instant she walked through the door, the most dangerous individual he had personally encountered since inhabiting this body. By a significant margin. She had also been, 400 years ago, obsessed with stealing the sword Gruhan. She looked at the protagonist with the focused curiosity of someone who has found something that does not add up and intends to understand it before moving on. She said things that were surface-level courtly and underneath that were precise probes, testing the edges of what he knew and how he knew it. He answered in kind, present enough to be credible, careful enough to reveal nothing she could use directly. Her clan had sent a formal proposal. She was to be offered as the protagonist's fiancée. The protagonist's first instinct was refusal. His second instinct, which arrived faster than the first had fully cleared, was that an elder high elf who was actively circling his identity was considerably less dangerous as a fiancé than as an opponent with nothing to gain from patience. He accepted. Sigrun, when informed of his acceptance, looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement, or might have been the confirmation of something she had suspected. He could not tell which, and the fact that he could not tell was itself information he filed away carefully. She was watching. He was watched. The engagement was, for both of them, a temporary arrangement held together by mutual interest in continued investigation. The third prince complicated things further. Jillian Leonberger was 12 years old, had achieved double chain at age 4, and had been told since birth that he was exceptional. He was. He was also the kind of exceptional that had not yet been tested by anything it could not immediately solve, which had produced a particular confidence that the protagonist recognized as fragile in the specific way that very bright things are fragile when they have not yet encountered something that outranks them. Gillian volunteered to be the protagonist's opponent in a formal bet duel, framed as a demonstration that the first prince's supposed improvement was a performance. He did this in front of the relevant court witnesses, which meant declining was not straightforward. The protagonist accepted. The bout lasted 11 seconds. He used one technique, delivered at the speed the poem of duel had made available to him, and Gillian was unconscious before he hit the ground. The protagonist handed the training sword back to the attendant and walked out of the yard without waiting for the audience's reaction. He was 2 days north before Gillian woke up and demanded a rematch. The journey to Winter Castle went through a blizzard. Not a metaphorical blizzard, an actual one. The kind that arrives from the Blade Mountains without significant warning and closes visibility to 20 feet and makes the road invisible under 8 inches of snow that is still accumulating. The caravan slowed. The soldiers at the back of the column were fighting the cold in the particular way that people fight cold when they are tired and there is no shelter visible, by stopping fighting it and just enduring it. The protagonist was near the rear of the column checking the formation when he found a soldier who had gone down. Not injured, simply out. Exhaustion and cold in combination, the body deciding it had reached its limit and sitting down to prove it. The man was a private, young, with the look of someone who had enlisted recently and not yet understood what North actually meant. The protagonist picked him up. He carried him for 2 hours through the storm, one arm around the soldier's back, matching the column's pace and not breaking it. He did not announce this. He did not ask for assistance. By the time they reached the shelter of the valley ahead, the man was awake again, and the protagonist put him down and told him to drink something warm and get back in formation. Word moved through the column the way word moves through a column, quietly and completely. By the time they reached Winter Castle's outer gates, every soldier in the caravan knew what had happened. None of them said anything about it to the protagonist directly, which was the right instinct. But the way they stood near him afterward was different from how they had stood near him before. Winter Castle was older than the protagonist expected, and younger than he remembered. The fortress sat at the foot of the Blade Mountains like a fist pressed against the stone. Low, thick-walled, built without elegance because elegance was not the point. The point was that it was still standing after 400 years, which it was. The protagonist stood at the gate and looked up at the walls and felt something that had no clean name. He had seen this place built. He had been present, in a different form, when the first stones were laid, and the man swinging the ceremonial hammer had been the only wielder he had ever considered a true friend. The walls were the same. The man was long gone. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and he held them without trying to resolve them. Vincent Valorhard met them at the inner gate. He was Bale's son, which meant he had inherited his father's directness and his father's tendency to make assessments before the other person had finished speaking. He looked at the protagonist with the expression of a man who has been told something he does not want to be true and is waiting for evidence that it isn't. He was commander of the castle's ranger company, which meant he was responsible for knowing exactly what lived in the mountains above them and exactly how much of it wanted to come down. He did not extend warmth. He extended professionalism, which was honest and which the protagonist respected. The orc scouting mission came within the first week. Vincent led it. The protagonist inserted himself into the unit with a straightforwardness that did not invite argument, and Vincent, who had enough tactical sense to recognize that the argument would cost more than it settled, did not make one. They went up into the lower reaches of the Blade Mountains with a unit of 12 rangers, moving through terrain that the protagonist found simultaneously unfamiliar in its current geography and deeply familiar in its bones. The same stone, the same cold, the same quality of silence that means something large is nearby and knows you are too. The orc scouts came from the North Ridge, 5 of them, moving with the particular confidence of creatures that have not been seriously threatened in this area recently. The protagonist killed 2 before the unit's formation fully engaged, using the Poem of Duel in close terrain where the orc's size advantage became a liability rather than an asset. The third orc, as it died, said something, not a roar, not an animal sound, words, in a language that had not been spoken in the Leonberger kingdom in 4 centuries, because the kingdom had long since forgotten anyone had ever bothered to learn it. The protagonist responded without thinking, which was the wrong move, because 2 of the rangers heard him, and the expression on Vincent's face when he turned around was the expression of a man filing away something he does not yet have context for. The protagonist said he had read it somewhere. Vincent looked at him for a moment and then looked away, which was a form of decision. The orc scouting parties yielded banners. The banner count became Vincent's informal method of keeping score, because the ranger company needed something to compete over during the long stretches between engagements, and competition was better than boredom. He had 26 by the end of the second week. The protagonist had 19, which bothered him more than he had expected it to. Count Bale, who had not mentioned his count to anyone, had 59. The protagonist found this out third hand, through a ranger who mentioned it assuming everyone already knew. He stood with this information for a moment and then started laughing, which was apparently unexpected enough that the ranger took a step back. It was the first time since taking the body that something had made him laugh without any calculation involved. He went and told Bale he knew. Bale shrugged with the specific shrug of a man who sees no reason to hide competence. Then a bird arrived from Sigrun. She wrote, in the elegant handwriting of someone with centuries of practice, that she hoped the combat unit the protagonist had recently encountered had been a sufficient gift. She mentioned that there were things deeper in the mountains that even she found interesting. She mentioned the orc combat unit's unusual formation. She said she hoped his development was proceeding satisfactorily. The protagonist read this twice. Then he understood that the orc combat unit that had been behaving strangely, moving with more tactical coherence than standard scouting parties, had been sent deliberately, a test, or an offering, depending on how generous you were feeling about the elder elf's methods. He wrote back one line, that her gifts required better wrapping. She did not respond, but a week later, when a unit of orc fighters with a banner he had not seen before appeared at the mountain pass, the banner was wrapped in white cloth. He unwrapped it. It was the banner of the Night Slayer's advance force. The Night Slayer was not like the scouting orcs. It was a mutant, a natural aberration that the mountain produced occasionally, the way extreme environments produce extreme things. Its mind's eye could read the intent of any fighter before the fighter's body had committed to it, which meant that against any trained opponent, it already knew what was coming. It commanded over 1,000 orcs. It had destroyed 3 border units in the past year, with losses that were not supposed to be possible. The protagonist challenged it to a formal 5-on-5 engagement on open ground, using the traditional orc duel protocol he had read in sources that did not currently exist in the kingdom's libraries. The Night Slayer accepted, because mutant orcs with mind's eye and 1,000 troops behind them can afford to accept formal duels. He brought Arwen. He brought 3 rangers. He brought Adelia. Adelia arrived at the engagement point looking slightly too small for the battlefield, which was always her appearance before she was in one, and then the Night Slayer's forward orc came at her, and something shifted. The trait called Butcher was not metaphorical. It activated on the first blood, hers, as the orc's opening strike caught her forearm, and what it did was remove the thing that makes trained fighters readable. Trained fighters are readable because they have patterns, instincts developed through repetition, the body's learned preference for efficient movement. Adelia's berserk state did not have patterns. It did not have instincts. It had outcomes, delivered through the absolute refusal of a body to calculate risk during the calculation. The Night Slayer's mind's eye was built to read intent. Adelia in berserk mode did not have intent in any form the mind's eye could classify. She moved the way weather moves, not toward anything, not away from anything, just through. The Night Slayer tried to read her twice and the third time stopped trying and retreated, which was information the protagonist filed immediately. The champion could be rattled. The duel escalated past its original terms when the orc army behind the Night Slayer started moving. Standard protocol violation, which meant the formal rules were over and the actual situation had begun. Count Bale did something then that the protagonist had not predicted. He started reciting. Not the poem Bale had heard from the protagonist. A fragment of it, imprecise, the lines an educated guess from a man who had been listening carefully for months and had the intelligence to reconstruct partial things from their echoes. The poem of Requiem, the poem of vengeance, evolved from the Avenger's incomplete verse, responded to Bale's attempt the way a fire responds to a breath. It caught. The mana chains in Bale's cultivation and the mana heart in the protagonist's body were not compatible systems. Everyone in the kingdom knew this. The chains destroyed hearts in direct contact. That was the established fact. 4 centuries of martial science confirming itself. The established fact was wrong. When Bale's chain resonated with the protagonist's poem, something happened in the space between them. A harmonic, like 2 instruments finding the same note from different directions. The protagonist felt it as a vibration in his mana heart. The rangers near Bale felt it as warmth in their weapons. Arwen felt it as a clarity that arrived without being summoned. Adelia, coming down from Berserk, felt it as a foundation beneath her feet, where there had been only ground before. The protagonist understood immediately what he was feeling. He lifted his voice and completed the poem. Not the poem of Requiem. What came out was something that had not existed before that moment, born from the specific resonance of the Requiem meeting Bale's chain power, meeting the cold air of the Blade Mountains, meeting the mana hearts of the Rangers, and the battle warmth of Arwen's extraordinary talent, and the particular wildness of Adelia's berserk aftermath. It assembled itself from those components with the inevitability of something that had been waiting for exactly this combination of ingredients. The Poem of Winter. The first large-scale war poem in 400 years. Every person in the engagement zone who had any cultivation at all felt the chant land in them. Knights who had dismissed the mana heart entirely found it pulling at their chain structure, not breaking it, not competing, but inviting it toward something. Rangers with no formal cultivation felt their bodies warm and their arms steady. Even the castle guards watching from the wall reported later that they had felt something. A sound that was not sound, a feeling of not being alone in the cold. The protagonist was at the center of it, and the protagonist was everywhere it reached simultaneously. He went at the Night Slayer. The champion's mind's eye could read intent. Against the poem of winter at full resonance, the protagonist's intent was not his alone. It was the aggregate intent of every person chanting behind him, which was not something a mind's eye designed for individual combat could process. The champion tried to read him and found something the size of an army looking back. The Night Slayer died with the protagonist's blade through its chest, and the orc army behind it stopped moving, and the silence that followed was the silence that fills a space after something definitive has happened. Winter Castle sent the Night Slayer's skull to the capital. The capital sent back 30 unanswered requests for reinforcement. 1 month, then 2. The orc army consolidated at the base of the mountains, growing in the way that armies grow when they are waiting for a specific signal. The protagonist's scouts counted units and reported numbers that climbed every week. The nobles whose territories lay south of Winter Castle, the ones the castle's walls were actively protecting, sent nothing. Count Guran wrote once, a letter of concern about supply costs, which the protagonist read and then used to light a lamp. By the end of the 3rd month, 30 requests had gone out and 30 silences had come back. Then Maximilian arrived. He came without the fanfare of a formal royal deployment, or, rather, he came with exactly that fanfare, but he had arranged it so the substance arrived before the ceremony did. The Iron Lions came through the south gate at dawn, 100 of them, with a unit of Silver Fox mercenaries behind them, and, behind those, a central army contingent that was officially listed in the dispatch as a training exercise deployment, which was the fiction the king had apparently required before signing the orders. The second prince was 17 and looked, at certain angles, exactly like the portrait of the founding king that hung in the castle's main hall. Not a strong resemblance, the kind of resemblance that emerges when you see someone in a specific light, doing something specific, and the image and the painting briefly occupy the same space in your mind. He walked into the great hall and met his older brother's eyes and said, with the directness of someone who had rehearsed not being nervous and had mostly succeeded, that he had come to help. The protagonist looked at him for a moment. He thought about what Leonberg had been at 17, the hunger, the clarity, the absolute commitment to the thing in front of him. He said he was glad Maximilian was here. They were awkward with each other, at first. The original Adrian had not been a brother in any functional sense, which meant the protagonist was navigating a relationship that had references but no actual history. Maximilian had come prepared to admire, and was not sure how to handle discovering that the admiration was apparently already merited. They talked around each other for 2 days, and then the orc warlord arrived and the oblique conversations became unnecessary. The orc warlord came down from the mountains at the head of 20,000 troops. He announced himself by throwing a spear. From a distance that should have made the throw impossible, the spear crossed the gap between the mountain pass and the castle's main spire, and removed the Leonberger banner from its post. The trajectory was not an accident. The aim was not a demonstration of strength. Strength was already established by the army behind him. The aim was a statement. I can reach anything you have put your name on. The castle's defenders watched the banner fall. The protagonist watched them watch it. He climbed the spire. This was not a tactical decision. It was a theatrical one, which the protagonist made with full awareness that it was theatrical, and the assessment that sometimes the right move is the one that resets what people believe is possible. He climbed the spire in full view of 20,000 orcs and the entire castle garrison, reached the top, and waited. The spear shaft was still there, wedged in the stone. He drew Damarong and cut the spear in half. Then he took the orc banner that had been attached to the spear's tip as a declaration of territory, held it up so both armies could see it, and brought it down with him. He planted it in the courtyard, his banner. The soldiers who had watched the original banner fall were now watching something different. The fear did not disappear. 20,000 orcs were still 20,000 orcs. But the fear reorganized itself around a point instead of spreading without limit. And a fear with a shape is manageable where a fear without one is not. The siege began that afternoon. 15 days. That was what Winter Castle gave them, in the end. 15 days against 20,000 orcs, with no reinforcements coming and the supply numbers declining, in the specific way that supply numbers decline when the rate of consumption exceeds the rate of resupply by a factor that cannot be compensated by rationing alone. The protagonist managed it the way he managed everything, by knowing more than he should have been able to know, and distributing that knowledge carefully, so that the people who needed it could act on it, without needing to understand where it came from. He had been present for sieges. He had been the weapon in the hand of the man directing them. He understood siege warfare at a level the kingdom's current tactical manuals did not contain, because the kingdom's current tactical manuals had been written after the era in which the most important lessons had been learned. He micromanaged the eastern wall rotation on day 3, redistributing the garrison in a pattern that the castle's regular commanders found unusual, and then found necessary when the eastern assault came at dawn of day 4 and hit exactly the section that had been reinforced. The wall held. Barely, day 6, the supply situation reached the threshold he had privately set as critical. He adjusted the meal schedule and the distribution order and said nothing about why. The soldiers accepted it with the resignation of soldiers who have learned that explanations come after the crisis. Day 8. Eli Bernardo arrived. He came with a conscript unit, noble-born men who had been caught in various legal tangles related to the protagonist's earlier purge of corrupt behavior in the capital, and had been assigned to Winter Castle as their legal consequence. They were not soldiers. They were soft men who had spent their lives in rooms that were heated, and they arrived at the front line of an active siege with the expressions of people who have made a serious error in their life choices. Eli was among them. He was an old acquaintance of the original Adrian from the social circuit. His family had used mana hearts and fallen into ruin, which meant he arrived at Winter Castle already carrying the weight of one failure and not particularly equipped for another. He was frightened in the clean way that honest people are frightened when they understand exactly what they are looking at. The protagonist recognized him. More importantly, he recognized the mana heart structure that Eli had apparently developed quietly, without guidance, from fragments of his family's old technique. It was crude. It was functional. It was the difference between someone who might survive the next 7 days and someone who would not. He pulled Eli aside on the second day and gave him 3 things: a correction to his mana heart's most dangerous structural flaw, an assignment that kept him in the second line rather than the first, and the information that he was watching. Eli survived. He survived Day 9, when the northern postern came under assault and the second-line units were pushed into active combat. He survived Day 11, when a troll, a creature approximately the height of a two-story building and considerably less architectural, breached the inner courtyard, and the protagonist put 3 sword techniques into it in sequence before it stopped moving. Eli watched this from 8 feet away and did not run, which the protagonist filed as evidence of character. By Day 13, the personnel numbers were real. Not alarming on paper real, actually, visibly, concretely real. The protagonist walked the wall at dusk and counted faces and noted the gaps between them. The poem of winter still ran through the garrison in its attenuated form. The chant picked up and passed around through shifts, giving each rotation slightly more than they would have had without it. But slightly more has a ceiling, and the ceiling was approaching. The council met on Day 14. The decision was not complicated, in the sense that the mathematics of it were clear. Winter Castle could not hold indefinitely against 20,000 orcs without reinforcement, and the reinforcement was not coming. What remained was the question of how to end it, with a slow attrition that ground the garrison down to nothing and gave the orcs an empty castle, or with a directed final action that cost everything but cost it towards something. The protagonist proposed the charge, not a defensive last stand. A charge, directly at the warlord, using the castle's remaining cavalry and the protagonist's personal unit as a spear aimed at the single point that mattered most. Kill the warlord, or damage him severely enough that the orc army lost its cohesion and the retreat became survivable. It was not a plan that offered good odds. It was a plan that offered the best available odds, which was a different thing. Count Bale would open the path. The protagonist would take the vanguard. Bale looked at this plan for a long time. Then he said it was acceptable. That night, Bale came to the protagonist's room and sat in the chair that had become his chair over the weeks of the siege, the one by the window, positioned so he could see both the door and the outer wall. He did not bring anything. He just sat. He said, after a while, that he had been thinking about the heart demon. The protagonist knew what he meant. During the bet fight in the palace, when the poem had overwhelmed Bale's resistance, it had planted something in him, a crack in the certainty of a man who has never been genuinely challenged. Heart demons were not metaphorical in this world. They were real, specific, and they had a way of finding the moments when a person was most tired. Bale said the demon had been loudest in the first week of the siege. Said it in the way men say things they have not said out loud before, carefully, testing the weight of the words as they leave. The protagonist said he was sorry for that. Bale said he was not asking for an apology. He said it had, in the end, shown him something he needed to see, that the thing he had called certainty for 40 years was not certainty but comfort, and that there was a difference. He said he had become more certain of a few things and less certain of several others, and that on balance this felt like improvement. He said he was proud of his nephew. The protagonist looked at the wall for a moment. He was a sword who had never had a family, and was currently inhabiting the body of a boy whose actual family had written him off, and the word nephew, spoken like that, in that tone, in that chair, landed somewhere specific. He said he knew. Bale nodded. He stayed until the fire burned low, and then he stood and said he would see the protagonist at dawn, and walked out. The charge began at first light. The Black Spear cavalry went first, the protagonist at their head, and the orc lines met them the way a wall meets a thrown stone, with mass and with damage distributed across the point of impact. The poem of winter ran through the cavalry unit as they rode, the chant passed between riders in shortened form, and what it did was make each rider feel the others beside them as something more than proximity. A network, a shared weight, the particular comfort of knowing that the force you are part of is larger than your own body. They reached the warlord's position in the second quarter of the field. The warlord was not what any account the protagonist had read had prepared him for, which said something, because the protagonist had read every account. He was simply too much, too large, too present, too far beyond the parameters that the kingdom's cultivation system had been designed to address. His battle spirit, the orc equivalent of mana, accumulated through combat, had been building for 400 years of tribal warfare. He stood in the middle of 20,000 soldiers, the way a mountain stands in the middle of a plain, not because he is holding them up, but because he simply is the largest thing present. He threw a spear at the protagonist from 30 feet. The protagonist cut it. He cut it, and the force of the throw still drove him back 4 steps, which told him what he needed to know about the arithmetic of the situation. He went in anyway, because the plan was the plan, and there was nothing to replace it with. Bale arrived at his flank. They fought the warlord together, 2 of them, coordinated, using the resonance of the poem to layer their attacks in sequences that neither of them could have managed alone. It was not enough. The warlord was not defeated by the 2-on-1. He was inconvenienced. There is a specific kind of opponent who makes you understand the difference between these 2 things in real time, and the orc warlord was that kind of opponent. He took what they gave him, sustained damage that would have ended any conventional fight, and kept moving. The protagonist took the spear to the chest on the 4th exchange. Not the throwing spear, a short weapon, delivered at range the protagonist had misjudged, and it caught him below the ribs and lifted him off his feet, and the world went white for a moment, and then gray, and then the cold ground was against his back. He was aware of Bale standing over him, aware of the sound of the battle behind them, aware that Bale was saying something, but the ringing in his ears had reduced the words to shape without content. Then he was aware of nothing, because Bale's hand came down on the side of his head with the precise, unhesitant force of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. He woke in a moving cart. Sir Quan was beside him. The cavalry was around him. The castle, he looked back. The castle was behind them, and the fires had started. He understood immediately. He did not need to be told. He had known Bale long enough to know how the man thought, and the logic of the decision was as clear as anything the man had ever said directly. If the protagonist could not win the fight, the protagonist leaving the fight was worth more than the protagonist staying in it. He tried to stand. Sir Quan put a hand on his shoulder, which was not a restraint, but was not nothing either. The protagonist stayed down. He looked at the castle. The fires were on the eastern tower first, which meant the breach had widened. The sound of combat carried over the distance in pieces, impacts, the particular register of large numbers of orcs, and then, at a moment he could not have timed but would remember, a single sound above the rest. A sword swing. One swing, extended beyond what any normal technique would allow, the kind of swing that costs everything and knows it. The sound of it reached him across the field. He put his hand against the side of the cart and held it there. Count Bale Valorhard, who had spent 40 years building a pentachain that nobody thought was achievable outside of legend, completed it in his final moments. He used every ring, every chain, every accumulated thread of cultivation simultaneously, not because it was tactically necessary, but because the person he was dedicating the swing to deserved the best one he had. Winter Castle fell. Vincent made the call. Not willingly. Willingly would not have been the right word for a choice that required abandoning the walls his family had held for 3 generations. He made it correctly, which was the only thing that was available to him, and he carried the weight of it on his face for every day afterward that the protagonist saw him. Antoine's mercenaries had prepared the escape routes. 3 months of quiet work, pre-positioned supplies, cleared paths through the mountain's lower passes. The Silver Fox had spent the siege building the exit, while everyone else was focused on the entrance. The survivors moved through those routes in the dark, guided by mercenaries who knew exactly where they were going because they had walked the paths in daylight specifically for this moment. The protagonist was unconscious for a week. He did not experience the retreat. He did not experience the establishment of the secondary defensive camp. He did not experience the accounting of losses, the messages sent to the capital, the council sessions about what came next. He was somewhere below all of that, in the dark behind his eyes, and the darkness was not empty. His body was forging something in it, assembling syllables from the material of what had just happened, and when he surfaced, he carried the shape of a new poem he had not consciously written. He woke to sunlight through canvas and the sound of a camp that was organized, but quiet in the way that camps are quiet after serious losses. Arwen was there. She had been there, he understood from her face, for most of the week. She had the look of someone who has been maintaining composure through repetition and is very tired of it. He asked about Bale, she told him. He stayed with that for a moment. Then he asked for his boots. The corrupt nobles had gathered at the secondary camp because the secondary camp was behind the military line and therefore safer than their own territories, several of which had been burned by the orc advance. Count Gurin was there. Baron Aaron, Baron Cardane, Baron Barheim, the men whose names appeared across 30 unanswered requests for reinforcement, each request more urgent than the last, each silence more deliberate than the one before it. They had come to the camp with their retinues, and their concerns about how the situation would affect their tax revenues. The protagonist walked into the assembly area without announcement. He was still moving carefully, the spear wound had not fully closed, and the week of unconsciousness had left the body slower than it should have been. None of this showed in his face. He looked at Count Guran. He said, in the tone of a man stating something that has already been decided, 30 requests, 3 months, and you chose. Guran began to explain. The protagonist let him finish the first sentence. Then he drew Damarong. The executions were not theatrical. They were precise, and they were public, and they were final. Count Guran, Baron Aaron, Count Hein, who had not merely refused but had actively argued against sending aid in the Capital Council. 3 others who had held the key supply routes and closed them. The survivors in the camp watched this without intervening. Maximilian watched it from across the yard with the expression of a young man updating his understanding of who his brother was. The soldiers watched it with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting for a specific accounting and are now receiving it. Baron Cardane and Barheim were spared. They had sent minimal aid, too little, too late, but not nothing. The protagonist looked at them for a moment after the others and said that minimal was not enough, and that he would remember the difference between minimal and nothing, and that they should also remember it. He put Damarong away. He stood in front of the assembled survivors, soldiers, knights, nobles who had come to the camp, mercenaries, the remains of the castle garrison, and he said something that he had not planned to say, that arrived already formed, the way things arrive when they have been building long enough. He said that Winter Castle had fallen. He said he was not going to pretend otherwise, and he was not going to offer explanations that were actually excuses. He said the men who had died there had deserved better from the kingdom than they received, and that the kingdom was going to hear about it, and that he was going to be the one saying it. He said he would not abandon the North. He said this not as a vow, he had no patience left for formal vows, but as a statement of what was going to happen. The Orc warlord was still out there. The Blade Mountains were still there. The second defensive line was a line, not a solution. He intended to build a solution, from whatever was available, using orc blood and orc bone, if that was what the materials required. He said that anyone who wanted to help was welcome to start now. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Vincent Valorhard, who had abandoned the castle his family had held for 3 generations and who had not spoken more than necessary since, walked across the yard and stood beside him. Then Arwen. Then the Silver Fox mercenaries, Antoine at their front, because they had assessed the situation and concluded that a 20-year contract with this particular prince was probably more interesting than anything else currently available. Then the soldiers. Then the knights. Then, slowly, the ones who had been watching to see which way it went. Maximilian stood at the edge of it all and looked at his older brother, and in his expression was something that was not quite admiration and not quite grief, something in between them, made from both, the feeling of watching someone become something that will cost them greatly, and being certain it is still the right thing. The Orc warlord was still alive. Sigrun was still watching from somewhere in the mountains, her agenda still unresolved. The Elder Elf's 1,000 years of patience, working on a timescale that the protagonist's current crisis did not fully account for. The king had effectively ceded the north and would not be easily moved from that position. The Borgonian Empire, which had been politically dominating the kingdom for years, would notice the weakness that Winter Castle's fall represented, and would begin doing what empires do when they notice weakness. And somewhere deeper in the Blade Mountains, past the Orc army, past the warlord, in the places that Sigrun had called interesting and declined to elaborate on, something waited. The protagonist knew about waiting. He had done it for 4 centuries. He was, for the first time in those 4 centuries, not waiting anymore.